Hi guys, hi. So welcome to the podcast. I think this is the second one that we've done. Today, it's me, Tom, from the Experimentation group, and we are talking to Steve from gamesuserresearch.com.
Hello, Tom, and thank you for having me today. I've been looking forward to our conversation.
Nice. It's good to have you here.
So, a little bit about my background. I am a games user researcher running a
Hmm.
lot of qualitative and a little bit of quantitative research to help developers and designers and producers inspire and check that their game vision is being met by what they're actually putting on actually in code.
Yes, and I used to do research as well, which is kind of like the other kind of cross, the way the paths crossed. So when I joined King initially, I was also a games user researcher, and then kind of moved on to join the experimentation group, which is what's taken me to the path I'm on now. But we both thought it would be really interesting to have a chat about how research and experimentation can complement each other, and where they do work and where they don't work, and how to get the most out of, or how to learn, I guess, in the most effective way about what really matters to your player base.
I think it's a really interesting topic. I think the value of both of our disciplines is helping people who are making games make decisions at the right time. And
Yeah.
obviously, each method has some strengths, and I'm looking forward to talking them through with you today.
Yeah, nice. Cool. So the first thing that we thought that we'd speak about is the fact that people are irrational, which is the thing which I kind of like came to learn from doing a lot of research, is that people are bad predictors
Mhm.
of their future behavior. And so in particularly in like earlier roles, I would often get asked like, what will happen if we build this thing? What will happen if we put the prices up? And there are ways to kind of project that forward,
Mhm.
but to actually ask somebody, if we built this thing, would you play it? Um, Became clear to me was like less and less of a good idea. And I think the thing which really crystallized that for me is in the experimentation group when we did the hard level labeling experiment.
Mhm.
Are you aware of hard level labeling, Steve?
I've seen it. Yes, I've seen you have a case study about it. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes, I've read this.
I mean, I'm sure we're all super familiar with it, right? Like it's when you're playing a kind of puzzle game in particular, have a lot of hard levels where every so often the level you're about to play will be signposted as this is harder than usual, this is
Mhm.
harder than normal, and that was the first experiment that the experimentation group ran, and it had a massive impact, like double-digit revenue increase, and wherever it's been used since then has kind of replicated that success. Like it's super useful.
Mhm.
But the thing which kind of struck me was, if I would have run a survey on that and asked people, if you saw this label on your level, would you spend more money? I don't think that people rationally, I think people will respond rationally and
Mhm.
say, of course not. Like, why would I do such a thing just because you tell me something's hard? Like, why would that make me spend more money? That's crazy. But actually, in reality, like, that is what happened, and it happened super consistently. Um, and so that was kind of like a real kind of light went on my head at that point,
Mm.
where I was like, aha, this is a place where you need to be really careful about the kind of the question that you're asking, or the kind of insight that you're looking for.
I think that's a really nice example. Yeah, there's many things that players just can't tell you, not because they're being evasive or lying to you, but because humans can't predict their future behavior particularly accurately just in their day-to-day life. They don't know,
Mm,
they don't have the context for their decision making, and decision making is often somewhat unconscious and, as you say, irrational. The most common example that you alluded to earlier is ultimately most teams want to know that question of, will people buy our game? If we
mm,
made this prototype into a full game, is there a market for it? Will people buy it? Will it be a success? Because fundamentally, that's the environment in which we're working in. We have to make successful games for teams.
mm,
The common error I see from teams is asking that question up front, just putting a game in front of people and saying, okay, here's some screenshots of a game, or here's a video, or play through a prototype. now would you buy this? Obviously, players will give an answer, they'll tell you something, but that answer doesn't reflect their real behaviour. It won't map particularly accurately to would they actually buy this at the end of the day. And that is a real trap that teams can often fall into, as I'm sure you've encountered throughout your career.
100%. So one of the things which we tried to do, one of my, I guess, in the transition phase between me working on insight stuff and product stuff, was trying to get an early read on whether players are going to enjoy a game. So obviously, working at King was like a lot of puzzle games, which are kind of, if you strip it down to its very kind of fundamental elements, you've got the core loop, the level, and then you've got the meta around that. And so what we tried is a bunch of different ideas of how we could get that early kind of spark of like, this is something which we think that people are going to continue playing versus not. And so some of the ideas that we had was stuff like, if we could put a prototype into players' hands and then crash it deliberately at X point, and then look at the proportion of people that reopened the game and carried on playing, would that give us a kind of idea of like, oh, the game is compelling enough for somebody to be taken out of the experience and go back into it?
I agree that behavioural data is going to be a lot more reliable. A similar example I've seen in qualitative user research is offering players a choice at the end of a session. So they've spent a whole bunch of time playing through a prototype or through a game. As a reward, would they like to take a copy of that game or take something, a promise of a future copy of that game, or a different game home with them? Again, pushing it into that behavioural space helps you look at what players would actually do rather than just what they believe they would do, which often don't map.
Yeah, that is an interesting idea. Actually, it reminds me of at one point we went to speak to Lego.
Oh, yes.
And they had some really interesting ways that they measure a kind of appeal of a set with kids. A couple of them, one of them was quite similar to the first example that I mentioned, where it's, if whilst they're observing kids play with the set, if they kind of drop it on the floor and it breaks, do they get upset and start to build it again? Is one thing. Or they ask they get the kids to write a Christmas list, like at the beginning of the session, and then get them to play with the toy, and then at the end redo the Christmas list. And if the thing that they've just played with enters the list, then they know.
I like that. That's a really
That's
nice
quite
example.
a good idea, isn't it?
Yeah.
But anyway, to get back to the point, so in terms of, this is what we would always recommend in terms of experimentation, is the idea of getting your idea out there ASAP. And so boiling down, or like coming up with a list of questions about what are the core assumptions or hypotheses about that kind of underpin the thing which we're thinking of building, and how can we test that with players as quickly as possible. So rather than kind of spending 6 months building what might be like some kind of huge feature and then launching it all at once and crossing your fingers and hoping for the best, like, how can you take a real thin slice of that, put it in players' hands, and see how they react? And the real beauty of that, like what we've seen with some of our clients, is that by focusing on your biggest hypothesis, like your biggest assumption about the thing that you're building, if you put that into players' hands and nothing happens, it's super clarifying, right?
Yeah.
Like, suddenly your massive backlog, your massive list of ideas is just swept away. And you know now, all right, we've just saved a bunch of time, because we could have spent 6 months like building this thing and it probably wouldn't have had an effect. Whereas now, with this little experiment, we've realized we need to look somewhere else, and it needs to be completely different to what we were thinking.
I like that idea of doing it as quickly and as lean as possible. What are some of the indicators that you look for what are you measuring in these early experiments to see if the game is working in the way in which the designers expected?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so the way that we like to work is, before we start to kind of have what we call an experimentation spec. So that will outline the area that we're working in, or the kind of the core hypothesis. We think that if we add this feature, it will have this effect. And beneath that, kind of different levels of metrics, like the main thing that we want to move, which almost universally so far has been retention, and then some secondary metrics beneath that. I think something which David in particular is really kind of interested in is, rather than going into kind of ever lengthening retention rates like D7, D30, D60, D90, is to look more at return rate, which is kind of like a rolling 1 day retention. And so it's like how many, regardless of how many days you've played the game, like how many people that played yesterday are playing today. And so what effectively that's saying is like how many people woke up this morning and were like, I've got to play that game today, which is much more immediate in terms of your ability to kind of measure it. So if you're looking at D30, you don't have to wait for 30 days to get there. But it's also much more kind of, I think it's kind of much more kind of compelling, or much more of a lead metric effectively. If you see your retention rate climbing, then it's quite likely that your D30 will climb too.
That makes a lot of sense, that it's a leading metric that you can probably assume it's going to have an impact on retention further down the line, but also just be a lot more nimble about running those experiments. You don't have to wait 30 days to see the results. I think retention as a topic also shows one of the nice opportunities for crossover with games user research area and the type of studies that I help teams with. So I guess a common scenario for mobile games is they've made a change, as you've described. They're seeing something different about the game, or they're implementing something different, and they've got a result. The retention has improved or not improved, but they haven't run that type of sharp, lean test that you described, where they've modified one thing, and so that it can correlate that change to the action they took. So often the type of scenario that will lead me to get involved with a retention study would be, there's a change about the game, and it's had an impact, but they're not sure why that impact's occurred, or what are the opportunities for them to further optimize the retention. What that might look like as a study is we'll do what's called a diary study. Again, you're probably familiar with it from your time in Insights, where we'll watch people play for that first time user experience or that 7-day period. Look out for what is the qualitative descriptive feedback of what players are doing, what is their behaviour within the game, and from that draw those hypotheses about, okay, this is why we're seeing a difference in the game. This is the thing that is leading to churn on day 3, for example, or even inspire new ideas. So teams might, through observing player behaviour, come up with potential new experiments they might want to run and see the impact of via a big quantitative study and an experiment.
That makes a lot of sense, and I think it's really useful. I always think it's quite interesting to look at that kind of parallel behaviour beyond your game. So, quite right, like if you've done an experiment and you look into the data and you see people behaving in an unexpected or unwanted way, like it's super useful definitely to go and speak to them and try and kind of puzzle out why that might be. But I think almost like the opposite end of the funnel, like looking at how people behave in other contexts, like what other games do they play, what do they like doing in those games, and be a really good kind of clue, I guess, about the types of things which might be interesting for you as well.
I agree. And yeah, sorry, I jumped right to the end of the production process when you have a thing and you're optimizing it. But yeah, as you alluded to, that primary question is often, we have a prototype. Will people play this? Even before you have a prototype to inspire what it should be, as you say, you learn a huge amount just by talking to players about their current playing behaviour on other games. Now, that avoids that risk of getting them to predict their future behaviour would they play your game, because it is just reflecting on actually what is their current behaviour, what are they playing, why are they playing it, how did they discover that game existed, what was their purchase journey that led them to play that game over another one. I think with even reasonably small sample of interviews, and you start to see those patterns, which will inspire not just what should our game be, but what should our marketing strategy be, what some of the game design decisions it will have to accommodate, where are people playing this, how long is a session length likely to be, all those things that will help your team throughout that development process make the right call the first time, and leads to less rework as they can make more accurate predictions about player behaviour.
And what are there interesting tools that allow you to do kind of qual and quant studies, like a diary study, right? Like a diary study back in the day, and I don't know whether things have evolved now, used to be kind of fairly onerous and also like prone to error, right? Because you're literally asking people to write everything down in a diary. Like, well, it is what it says on the tin. But I imagine these days people are on their phones so much that there must be kind of quite smart ways to kind of collect that information in a more reliable manner.
Yeah, I think you're right that both tooling has improved and also having a smartphone has improved. So there are tools out there. We mentioned Playtest Cloud is one way of looking at players' behaviour over time. There are diary study tools. I think DScout is quite a popular one. But what I like about the opportunity, I'm not a very tools-based person. I'm agnostic to many tools. But what I like about the opportunities from smartphones and mobile phones is you can get a much broader variety of types of data back from it. So, for example, you can install a thing on the phone that logs actually how long are they spending on each app, or I think iPhones these days do that automatically. Will log your time on each app each day, which is useful data. It has a camera, so you can ask people to record videos of them doing a thing in context or capture their thoughts verbally. It offers the opportunity to get that mix of qualitative and quantitative measurements throughout their day, and just help build that broader picture of what players are doing. But yeah, so although there are tools out there, I think just the opportunities given by having that device with us allows us to get that true, authentic understanding of how players are spending their days and how does games fit into that. I said I'm not very tools based. I think for many of the studios I talk to, they probably don't have a huge amount of budget to get very expensive enterprise level tools to do this. And so although you are somewhat reliant on recollection, I also think teams get a huge amount of value just by interviews. Taking a few minutes from the start of a current playtest you have planned, or scheduling specific interviews, and just asking players, hey, what are you playing currently? Why are you playing that game? What led you to buy it? What are your thoughts about it? Will again build up that understanding and that picture of the context of use for players for our games, and help us make better decisions.
I think it makes it. I always used to find, or used to feel that it makes a massive difference when members of the games team or members of the studio come along to the actual interviews, and you can see the person in real life and look at what their body language is like and how they're interacting with the game, rather than skip it and come to the presentation at the end, which is kind of it's so synthesized and summarized that although it does reflect what happened in the interviews, it's kind of missing some of that kind of cultural context and nuance, which you get by like actually being in the room.
I agree 100%. How I like to think about our role as user researchers and people who are going answering these questions is our job isn't to write the report. Our job isn't to find out the thing, to know the things ourselves, because we're not decision makers. The type of people who need to act on our information are producers, designers, developers, creative directors. Those are decision makers who are taking action based on this. And so an important part of our role is making sure that our findings are understood and embedded by the teams we work with. Bringing teams along to sessions and encouraging them to see research firsthand is a really important part of that. There are other things you can do as well, rather than just doing a report, making it a more interactive session where teams are thinking about how to apply what they're hearing and what what they've learned from this will help make it more real. And and that's ultimately the point of any of these things. If it's not informing real decision making based on our teams, it's pointless doing it. A secondary benefit is also just that it means teams believe you. Sometimes, and I'm sure you found this as well. Sometimes the results from exposing our ideas and our games to players can be controversial. They're going to act in a way you didn't expect. They're going to act in a way that's going to throw your roadmap into chaos. And one of the early reactions that teams might have is to disregard the research, to think those weren't our real players, or this study wasn't designed in the right way to give reliable answers. And yes, maybe that could be the case, although a good researcher or insight professional would avoid that. And I think exposing developers, as you said, to players firsthand will help build their faith in the reliability of the studies that we run. I don't know, do you get that because obviously a lot of your experiments are a lot more quantitative. Do you get that same pushback to this experiment isn't representative, or there's something wrong with the experiment when the finding is controversial?
I think so. There's definitely the case where results come back and they're unexpected, but the benefit of doing experimentation is that you can dig into the data quite deeply to try and understand, like, are we seeing something genuine here, like a genuine difference based on the question we were asking, or is there an issue in the way we set this up, or some kind of bug or something like that? And so I think maybe that's where the discussion around results can be a bit more constructive, I guess, because quite often it's taken the whole team to put it together, right? Like, and so then when you see the results come in and they're not what you expected, it almost feels like a collective responsibility to be like, hang on, is this right? And then what you're able to do, crucially, if you're seeing something like an issue with the way that you've designed the experiment, is to alter it and to go again. And so I guess, which is a bit different with research, right? Like once you've done the study, you would have to completely restart the study, wouldn't you? To go back again.
There are opportunities to run studies in an iterative manner. I don't know if you come across rapid iterative testing. I'm going to guess evaluation. You might have to Google what the E stands for. There's a case study all the way back from the early 2000s, I think for Age of Empires, and it's a method that I've applied for some other studies since, where by exposing some variables from the games, you can do run the study one day, draw some quick conclusions on day two, change some variables, run the study again on day three, draw some conclusions on day four, and try to achieve a faster cadence of studies. But that requires the right build in the right situation, and so isn't as natural fit as it is for the type of quantitative experimentation work that a lot of your work will be about.
It is interesting, though, isn't it? In that, I think what's at the heart of both techniques, experimentation and research, is putting the player in the prime position for decision making within the group, and to base the direction of the game and the effort that the team is putting in, like the investment of the team, on what we actually see players either kind of do or say about what they like and dislike about a game. And so it's interesting that in one case, in the experimentation case, it seems to be more kind of a collective, let's make this work kind of thing. Whereas I've definitely had the same experience when you report back on a study and people have been a bit like, oh, this isn't what I expected. It's rubbish.
Yeah.
Ignore it. I guess maybe part of that is the fact that often it does happen exactly what you were saying, right? Like if it happens out of the way of the team, and then comes back in a way which is disruptive to the backlog or to the assumptions of the team, then it can be it's easy to kind of minimize it.
I think perhaps the solution to this, and ultimately, I liked the framing of your point about it being around players, is regardless of whether you're doing experimentation or running either qualitative research like a usability test or something quantitative like a survey, ultimately we should be thinking about what decisions do the team need to make. And the starting point of any of these activities is sitting with your development team or the team you're working with, understand what decisions they have coming up. What are the risks that they're worried about? What are they deciding to prioritize? Where are they spending their time? And then what kind of data would help them make that decision either faster or more confidently, or just make a better decision? Sometimes that's measurement data, which might lead you towards experimentation. It might lead you towards other forms of quantitative work like a survey. Sometimes that's what the data they need is more descriptive, and it might push you towards observation, seeing how players react to a situation, or seeing what players say about a thing. But as long as we're starting with what do teams need to know today to make the decisions they need to make, you should hopefully avoid some of those complaints later on about, well, this isn't relevant, or I don't believe it, or this isn't the right kind of data for the question that I want to answer at this time.
Yeah, I used to, at the top of every survey, when you're kind of gathering questions and everybody's like, can we just ask about this thing? Make a little grid where it was the first column was the question they were asking, and the second column was effectively, why are we asking it? Like, what are we going to do with the results of this? And then I don't think I got to the level of doing a kind of like benchmark yes no kind of situation, but what I found that super useful in kind of almost like keeping the process honest, so then when the data comes back, it makes it much easier to kind of report out, because you're like, here, question 4, the reason we're asking this is to understand, do people like this type of game, as a proxy to would they enjoy this type of feature kind of thing. And then if you see that type of game is really low down the list, then it's, you can report back to the team like, we thought we would want to see this happen and that happened, and therefore we're going to make a different decision than we might have done otherwise.
What I really like about that is that framing around what are we going to do with this data at the other side. A common experience that I've seen teams have, and one of the reasons why they might not be getting the impact from the research that they'd hoped to run, is running a research study, running potentially an experiment, just because it's the type of thing that we need to do. We're hitting a milestone. When we hit a milestone, we'll run a play test, or we'll run a usability study, or we'll do a survey to see what people think. And then you get everyone chucking in their own questions and the things that they've come up with they want to learn, but it becomes rapidly very unfocused. You've lost that link towards we're making a decision. You don't know what you're going to do with the data when you get it back. And it leads to big unwieldy tests. It leads to low impact studies. And again, complete opposite of the approach that you described of getting teams to articulate a single hypothesis, prioritizing the most important hypothesis, and then testing just that so that teams know what they're going to do as a result.
Yeah. Which I guess comes down to then the need, or the kind of the optimal situation being putting your team in a situation where you are frequently gathering data. Like, I think I wrote down in the notes, right, like your job as a team is more about asking and answering the right questions than knowing all the answers. Like, if you're constantly questioning, why are we doing this? What must be true for this outcome to be possible, and putting that out into your players' hands and getting the answers back, then you're going to make much better decisions than if, being a closed book and assuming that you know the answer.
I agree entirely. And whether it is ego, people obviously experts in their field and don't want to have their expertise tested, or just the challenges of production, that can be a constant struggle. Again, one of the traps that you see teams fall into is falling too hard into that project management mindset of thinking, well, we've got to launch a game by this, we have to launch an update by this time, and so our job is just to create the right amount of content and then launch the thing at the end. Treating it as a series of deadlines with a defined output, rather than thinking about actually what is the value we're trying to create by creating this content update or making this game. How will we recognize if we're achieving that value? How will we recognize if players are enjoying this? How will we recognize if this is good enough to draw players from a competitor game into our game? And then exposing that so that you can measure that throughout development, rather than just piling straight on to the next deadline that you hit.
And what we found really useful by using experimentation and this kind of like question-focused method of production is that it becomes incremental. The benefits just grow over time as you learn more. So you ship this feature as you would have done anyway, but as a kind of a secondary output almost, or like an additional output, is now you've got this learning. Now you've got this bit of information about something that your players really enjoy, that you can then, the next thing that you build is going to be that incrementally bit better, most likely, because now you understand something that you didn't understand before. Like it's, you can become kind of very smart as a team by consistently learning, questioning and learning in that way. Like it's a very it's cool. All right. Well, that was really fun. That was a really nice discussion.
I enjoyed
Thanks very much.
I think there's a lot more we could dive into in the future, so I look forward to talking again.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you, Tom.
Okay. Cheers, Steve. Bye.